The winter of 1887 came down on the Blackwood Valley like a hammer. It was not a gentle arrival, not a slow dusting of snow that promised cozy evenings by the fire. It was a declaration of war from the sky, a sudden and brutal siege. The cold did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the chinking of the log cabins like a thief, stole the breath from sleeping children, and laid a layer of frost on the inside of the window panes that was as thick as a silver coin. The wind was its accomplice, a relentless force that howled through the pines with a sound like grieving, and when it found a crack in a wall, it sliced through the interior air like a knife. For the settlers in this remote pocket of the territory, survival was measured in cords of wood. A family's wealth was not in their land or their livestock, but in the height and breadth of the woodpile that stood against the north wall of their cabin. Yet this winter, the wood was not enough. The cold was a glutton, devouring the fuel with an insatiable appetite. Fires that should have warmed a room for hours seemed to give off only a sullen, localized heat, a small circle of comfort in a sea of biting chill. Families burned through their autumn stacks at an alarming rate, their faces etched with a constant, low-grade anxiety. In a small cabin at the western edge of the settlement, Elara felt the siege more acutely than most. She was a widow, her husband taken by a fever the summer before, leaving her with their 7-year-old son, Thomas, and a cabin built to the same flawed specifications as all the others. It was a standard design, passed down from one settler to the next. A single room of notched logs, a stone fireplace at one end, and a cast-iron stove in the center for cooking and supplemental heat. It was supposed to be enough. It had never been enough. The stove was a tyrant. It demanded constant tribute, a steady diet of split oak and pine. When it was fed, it glowed a menacing red, radiating a heat so fierce it was uncomfortable to stand near. But this heat was fleeting, a temporary victory that rose quickly to the ceiling and vanished, leaving the floor and the corners of the room in a perpetual state of near freezing. 10 feet from the stove, the air was a different climate altogether. Thomas slept in a nest of blankets and quilts so thick he looked like a small mound of earth, yet his breath still plumed in the air above his face. Elara spent her nights moving between her own cold bed and the stove, feeding it, stoking it, her hands raw from the wood and her eyes heavy with a sleep that would not come. The struggle was universal. Down the path, the Millers were burning through their wood twice as fast as the year before. John Miller, a man whose hands were as thick and calloused as oak bark, confessed to his neighbor that he was already eyeing the green wood he had cut for the following year. Further on, the Henderson family had hung heavy blankets over their doors and windows, plunging their home into a perpetual twilight in a desperate attempt to trap what little warmth they could generate. They lived like bears in a den, but the cold was a creature that could not be barred. It found its way in. It always found its way in. Their methods were the same because their knowledge was the same. A collection of traditions that had proven barely adequate in milder years and was now failing them completely. Elara knew this path led to ruin. She could count the remaining logs in her woodshed. She could do the grim arithmetic. Long before the spring thaw, the wood would be gone. Then would come the slow, creeping cold, the kind that did not kill quickly, but wore a person down, weakening the body and the spirit until there was nothing left to fight with. She looked at her son, his small face pale in the dim light, and a different kind of cold, a cold of pure fear, clenched her heart. The traditional way was the way of starvation, a slow freezing in the dark. She would not let that happen. There had to be another way. She was an outsider, not by choice, but by circumstance. She and her late husband, Marcus, had arrived only a year prior. He had been an engineer in the old country, a man who saw the world in terms of principles and forces, of stress and thermal dynamics. He was not a frontiersman. He was a thinker, a quiet man who carried more books than tools. The other settlers had been polite but distant, wary of his soft hands and his strange accent. They saw him as a dreamer, a man unsuited for the harsh realities of their world. When he died, that assessment was transferred to his widow. She was seen as a fragile thing, a woman ill-equipped for the brutal calculus of survival. But Marcus had left her more than a half-finished cabin and a legacy of quiet skepticism. He had left her his books and his journals, filled with elegant script and precise, intricate drawings. In the evenings, while Thomas slept and the stove devoured another log, Elara would sit by the flickering lamplight and read. She read about Roman hypocausts, about Russian masonry stoves, and about the great ceramic ovens of Germany, the Kachelofen, that could heat a whole house for a day with a single small fire. Marcus had been obsessed with them. His journals were filled with calculations, with sketches of serpentine channels and heat-exchanging chambers. He had believed the settlers had it all wrong. They were fighting the cold with fire, a direct and brutish confrontation. The real answer, he had written, was not to fight the cold, but to manage the heat. One night, as the wind rattled the door in its frame, a specific drawing caught her eye. It was not for a grand oven, but for something simpler, something that could be retrofitted. It was a massive, serpentine brick structure designed to be built directly behind a simple iron stove. The idea was radical in its simplicity. Instead of letting the hot smoke and gases rush up the stovepipe and out of the house, carrying 80% of the fire's heat with it, this design forced the exhaust through a long, winding maze of brick channels. The bricks, a dense and stable material, would absorb the intense heat from the smoke. By the time the smoke finally exited the chimney, it would be cool to the touch, having surrendered all its thermal energy to the brick mass. That mass would then radiate a gentle, steady warmth for hours, long after the fire in the stove had died out. It was a heat battery. The next morning, she took a charred stick from the fireplace and knelt in the dirt floor of her cabin. She cleared a space behind the stove and began to draw. She copied the design from her husband's journal, her lines straight and confident. She drew the footprint of the base, the intricate path of the flues, the position of the clean-out doors. It would be massive, a solid wall of brick and mortar that would dominate the small room. It was an idea so contrary to local wisdom that it felt like a form of madness. Here, everyone knew that a fire needed to breathe, that smoke needed to escape as quickly as possible. Trapping it seemed dangerous, foolish. They believed heat came from the flame, not from the stone. Silas Croft was the first to see the drawing. He was the settlement's most experienced builder, a man whose judgment on any matter of construction was considered final. He had come to check on the widow, an act of gruff charity he performed every few weeks. He was a practical man, a man who trusted what he could see and touch. He saw the drawing in the dirt and stopped, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What is this, woman?" he asked, his voice not unkind but deeply skeptical. Elara explained the principle as Marcus had written it. She spoke of thermal mass, of heat exchange, of capturing the energy before it fled up the chimney. She pointed to her existing stovepipe, slick with creosote on the inside. "All that black," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "is wasted fuel. All the heat that makes it is wasted. This saves it." Silas stared at the drawing, then at her, then back at the drawing. He slowly shook his head. A small, dry laugh escaped his lips. "You aim to choke your own fire?" he said, the laugh turning into a dismissive chuckle. "You'll fill your house with smoke if you don't burn it down first. The heat belongs in the stove, not in a pile of bricks behind it. The bricks will just block it. It's foolishness." He kicked a bit of dirt over a corner of her drawing, a gesture of finality. "Stick to what works, Ilara. Chop more wood. That's the only answer there is." His verdict spread through the settlement like a contagion. "The widow's folly," they called it. At the general store, men leaned against the counter and laughed. "Heard Ilara's building a stove inside a stove," one would say, and the others would shake their heads in amusement. "Trying to catch the smoke," another would add with a grin. "Maybe she'll try to bail the wind next." They saw it as proof of what they had always suspected, that she, like her husband, was a dreamer, disconnected from the hard truths of the land. Their mockery was not born of malice, but of a deep-seated fear of the unknown. Their way of life was precarious, and they clung to their traditions like a man clinging to a log in a flood. To question those traditions was to question the very foundation of their survival. It was easier to laugh than to consider that they might be wrong. Despite the laughter, despite the warnings and the pitying looks, Ilara began her work. She had no money to buy new bricks, but she knew of a place. At the far end of the valley lay the ruins of an old brickyard, abandoned years ago after the clay seam had proven too inconsistent. Most of the bricks were flawed, cracked, or misshapen, but many were still solid. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen, she would take an old wheelbarrow with a squeaking axle and make the long trek to the yard. The work was brutal. She dug through piles of rubble, her hands, protected only by thin leather gloves, quickly becoming scraped and raw. She sorted the bricks, testing each one with a tap of a hammer, listening for the clear, solid ring that signified integrity. A dull thud meant a crack, a weakness that could not be trusted. She loaded the good ones into the wheelbarrow, a task that strained every muscle in her back and shoulders, and began the slow journey home. The wheelbarrow, heavy with its cargo of clay and hope, fought her every step of the way, its one wheel sinking into the frozen ruts of the path. The squeak of its axle was a lonely, rhythmic complaint against the vast silence of the valley. Back at the cabin, she did not rest. She had to make her own mortar. She dug clay from the creek bed, a thick, greasy substance that clung to her shovel and boots. She sifted sand from a deposit downriver, carrying it back in heavy buckets. She mixed them with water, her hands plunging into the icy slurry, kneading and turning until it reached the right consistency. It was an ancient recipe, one described in Marcus's books, far superior to the simple mud and straw chinking used by the other settlers. Then came the building. She laid the foundation first, a solid, level base of the largest, flattest stones she could find. Upon this, she began to lay the bricks, one by one. Her work was slow, methodical, and precise. This was not like building a simple wall. This was like solving a puzzle in 3 dimensions. Each brick had to be perfectly placed to form the complex, winding channels that would guide the hot gases on their long journey. She followed the drawing in the dirt, which she renewed each morning, measuring every course, checking every angle. She was not just stacking bricks, she was engineering a system. She was building an engine designed to capture an invisible force. While Ilara worked with her quiet, focused diligence, the rest of the community engaged in a frenzy of traditional winter preparation. The air was filled with the rhythmic thud of axes splitting wood and the grating screech of crosscut saws. Men worked from dawn until dusk, their breath fogging in the frigid air, their faces set in grim lines of determination. They were shoring up their defenses, adding another layer of the same armor that was already failing them. They banked snow against the foundations of their cabins, stuffed rags into cracks, and piled their wood piles ever higher, a monument to their faith in brute force. When they passed Ilara's cabin, they would see her, often on her knees, trowel in hand, meticulously setting another brick. They saw a woman engaged in a strange and pointless ritual. Silas Croft, making his rounds, stopped once more. He watched her for a long moment, her movements patient and sure. "You're wasting good building time," he called out, his voice carrying on the crisp air. "That wall won't keep you any warmer. A good fire and a good stove, that's all a body needs." He shook his head and walked on, convinced he was watching a tragedy of stubbornness unfold. The women of the settlement would sometimes stop, offering a loaf of bread or a bit of advice. "You'll get a chill, Ilara, working in the damp like that," one said. "A woman alone shouldn't be doing such heavy labor," said another. Their concern was genuine, but it was wrapped in a thick blanket of condescension. They saw a widow spiraling into eccentricity, lost without a man to guide her. Ilara simply nodded, thanked them for their concern, and returned to her work. She did not have the energy to argue, nor the inclination. Her husband had taught her that the most elegant proof was a functioning machine. The truth of her work would not be found in words, but in warmth. So she focused on the details. She created the first long, vertical channel for the smoke to rise from the stovepipe connection. Then, at the top, she built the turn, laying the bricks to guide the flow horizontally. From there, it would descend, then rise again, then descend once more before finally being allowed to exit into the chimney flue. It was a maze of heat. She used fire bricks, the ones that had been properly fired and were a deep, rich red, for the channels closest to the stove connection, where the heat would be most intense. The softer, salmon-colored bricks she used for the outer shell. This outer wall was separated from the inner core by a small air gap, another detail from Marcus's drawings. The air itself would act as an insulator, preventing the outer surface from becoming dangerously hot and encouraging the heat to radiate slowly and evenly. She sealed every joint with her tenacious clay mortar, her fingers pressing it into the gaps, ensuring there would be no leaks, no escape for the precious heat or the dangerous smoke. The structure grew slowly, a solid, unadorned monolith of red and brown against the rough-hewn logs of the cabin wall. It had no beauty, save the stark beauty of purpose. It was a declaration of faith in a principle that no one else in the valley could see. The first week of December, the hammer fell. It came not as a storm, but as a silence. The wind dropped. The sky cleared to a brilliant, merciless blue, and the temperature plummeted. This was not the familiar cold that nipped at the ears and nose. This was an Arctic cold, an invasive, predatory force that seemed to drain the very life from the air. The settlers called it a still killer. The trees in the forest groaned and cracked with the frost, the sound like pistol shots in the profound stillness. Metal became so cold it would burn the skin on contact. A bucket of water left outside froze solid in under an hour. Inside the cabins, the battle became desperate. The settlers fed their stoves relentlessly, turning them into roaring furnaces. The iron glowed cherry red, but the heat felt thin and sharp, unable to penetrate the profound chill that pressed in from all sides. The cold gained ground, foot by foot. It crept across the floors, climbed the walls. Frost bloomed in fantastical patterns on the nail-heads that held the cabins together. Drafts that had been minor annoyances now felt like streams of icy water. The cabins, which had always been a refuge, now felt like traps, barely holding the lethal cold at bay. At the Miller house, the family huddled together in a single bed, buried under every blanket they owned. John Miller stayed up all night, a grim sentinel, feeding the stove. But the wood, which seemed to burn almost instantly into white ash, gave little in return. By morning, the water in the basin next to the stove was filmed with ice. His youngest daughter coughed a dry, rattling cough that terrified him. He knew that if the cold did not let up, he would soon be burning his furniture, then the boards from his barn. He was losing. Silas Croft, the master builder, fared little better. His cabin was the best built in the valley, his chinking meticulous, his fireplace stones perfectly fitted. He had always taken pride in his work, in his understanding of how to build against the elements. But his craft was failing him. The great stone fireplace, which had always been his pride, was now a liability. It drew vast quantities of air from the room, pulling the cold in through every tiny crack and crevice to feed its insatiable appetite. The room was warmer than Miller's, but it was a drafty, uneven warmth. His wife sat as close to the fire as she dared, wrapped in a bearskin rug, but her face was pale and her hands were like ice. He felt a deep, gnawing shame. He, the man who knew how to build, was being defeated. He was wrong. The thought was a splinter in his mind. In Ilara's cabin, something entirely different was happening. When the still killer had descended, she had felt it, of course. The air outside the door was a physical blow, but inside, a quiet miracle was unfolding. The day before, she had laid the final brick and sealed the final joint of her masonry heater. She had let it cure for a full day, then lit a small, cautious fire in her stove. Now, as the great cold settled over the valley, she lit her first proper fire. She used only a few small logs of dry pine, less than an armful. She got them burning hot and fast, the way Marcus's journal had instructed. The goal was a quick, intense combustion that would produce the maximum amount of heat and the minimum amount of creosote. The iron stove grew hot, and the pipe leading into the brick mass began to radiate a fierce heat. For an hour, the fire roared. Then, as the wood turned to glowing coals, she shut the stove's air intake, and the fire slowly died. And then, there was only silence. The stove began to cool, but the brick mass behind it had awakened. It had soaked up the frantic energy of the fire and now began to release it, not as a blast of scorching air, but as a gentle, pervasive radiance. It was a warmth you felt in your bones. It did not rise to the ceiling. It seemed to spread evenly through the room, from the floor to the rafters. There were no cold spots, no drafts. The frost on the inside of the windows began to melt, trickling down the panes in slow, clear tears. Thomas, her son, sat on the floor, playing with his wooden soldiers, wearing only his normal woolen shirt. He was not huddled by the stove. He was in the middle of the room, his cheeks flushed with color, perfectly comfortable. Ilara placed her hand on the brick wall. It was not hot to the touch, just deeply, wonderfully warm, like a stone that has been lying in the sun all day. She needed only 2 small fires a day, one in the morning and one in the evening, to maintain this steady, effortless warmth. Her woodpile, the one everyone had pitied, was barely shrinking. While her neighbors were locked in a desperate, losing battle, burning through their fuel and their hope, Ilara and her son lived in a small bubble of calm, summer-like warmth. The storm raged outside, the world froze, but her creation held the line. It worked. For 2 days, the still killer held the valley in its grip. On the 3rd day, the temperature rose slightly, but it was replaced by a new enemy. The sky turned a leaden gray, and a wind began to pick up from the north, carrying with it the first flakes of snow. It was the beginning of a blizzard that would be spoken of for generations. The wind howled like a hungry wolf, driving the snow horizontally, erasing the world in a swirling vortex of white. It piled the snow into monstrous drifts that buried fences and blocked doors. It was a storm that did not just cover the land, it consumed it. The settlers were now prisoners in their own failing fortresses. The wind was a battering ram, finding and exploiting every weakness in their construction. It drove fine, powdery snow through the tiniest gaps in the walls, which accumulated in ghostly white lines on the floors. The relentless noise, the constant shrieking pressure of the wind, was as draining as the cold itself. The fight for warmth became a fight for life. It was Silas Croft who broke first. not from the cold in his own house, which was bad enough, but from a deeper fear. His daughter and her 2 small children lived a quarter-mile away, in a cabin he had built for them himself. It was a good cabin, solid and true, but it was built on the same principles as his own. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind, that they would be in trouble. The thought of his grandchildren, shivering in the dark, was a torment he could not endure. He had to check on them. But the path to their cabin was impassable, blocked by a drift as tall as a man. Then a thought, unwelcome and persistent, entered his mind. The widow, Ilara. Her cabin was on the way, or what used to be the way. He remembered her strange brick wall, her foolish talk of catching smoke. He had laughed at her. Now, in his desperation, a sliver of impossible curiosity lodged itself in his heart. He had to see. He had to know if her folly had consumed her, or if, by some miracle, it had saved her. Pulling on his heaviest coat and wrapping a scarf around his face, he took a shovel and plunged into the white maelstrom. The journey was a nightmare. The wind tore at him, stealing his breath and blinding him with snow. He could see no more than a few feet in front of him. He navigated by memory, by the feel of the land beneath his feet. He fell a dozen times, the snow consuming him, his will the only thing that forced him back to his feet. It took him nearly an hour to cover a distance he could normally walk in 10 minutes. When he finally saw the dark shape of Ilara's cabin through the swirling snow, he was exhausted, half frozen, and filled with a grim certainty of what he would find inside. A frozen, silent room, a dead stove, and a woman and child huddled under a pile of blankets, perhaps already beyond help. He stumbled to the door and pounded on it with his gloved fist, shouting her name against the roar of the wind. There was a pause, and then he heard the sound of the wooden bar being lifted from inside. The door swung open, and Silas fell into the room, bringing a blast of wind and snow with him. He scrambled to push the door closed, his body shaking uncontrollably from the cold and the exertion. He leaned against the wood for a moment, his eyes squeezed shut, waiting for his senses to return. The first thing he registered was the silence. The roar of the blizzard was instantly muffled, reduced to a distant, powerless hum. The second thing was the quality of the air. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overworked stove, nor the damp, biting chill of a room losing its battle with the cold. It was a calm, gentle, and pervasive warmth. It was like stepping into a peaceful summer afternoon. He opened his eyes. The room was bathed in the soft, steady light of a single oil lamp. In the center of the floor, the boy, Thomas, was sitting, calmly drawing on a piece of slate. He was wearing a simple shirt and trousers. He was not shivering. He looked up at Silas and gave a small, curious smile. Across the room, Ilara stood by the table, a look of concern on her face. And against the far wall stood the brick monolith. It was a silent, unassuming presence, radiating a warmth that felt as natural and life-giving as sunlight. There was no fire in the stove. Silas stared, his mind struggling to reconcile what his senses were telling him with everything he had ever believed to be true. He looked at the stove, cold and black. He looked at the brick wall, which seemed to be the source of all the warmth in the universe. He looked at the peaceful child, the calm woman. He looked at the windows, which were clear of frost. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and the air that filled his lungs was warm. He was a proud man, a man whose identity was built on his competence and his knowledge. In that moment, the foundation of that identity crumbled into dust. He had not just been wrong, he had been spectacularly, dangerously, arrogantly wrong. His knowledge was a collection of half-truths. His pride was ignorance. He had laughed at this woman, and she had been building a sanctuary. He had been building a tomb. Ilara said nothing. She did not gloat. She did not say, "I told you so." She simply walked to a cupboard, took down a ceramic mug, and poured him some hot tea from a kettle that was sitting on the warm surface of the brick structure. She handed it to him. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it. "Sit down, Silas," she said, her voice gentle. "You look frozen through." He collapsed onto a small wooden stool, the warmth of the mug seeping into his frozen fingers. He took a sip of the tea, and the heat spread through his chest. He looked around the room again, at the impossible, life-saving reality of it. The wind howled outside, a beast trying to claw its way in, but in here it had no power. The cold had been defeated, not by a roaring fire, but by quiet wisdom and a pile of bricks. The silence in the room stretched on, broken only by the distant scream of the wind and the soft scratch of the boy's chalk on his slate. Silas looked at Alara, his eyes filled with a dawning awe and a profound, shattering humility. He had come expecting to be a savior. Instead, he was the one who needed saving. When the blizzard finally broke 2 days later, leaving behind a world transformed, a world of deep, sculptural drifts and blinding white silence, word began to spread. It started with Silas. He did not go home right away. He stayed at Alara's through the worst of the storm, a silent, humbled guest. When he finally returned to his own frigid cabin, he was a changed man. His wife saw it in his eyes. He gathered his neighbors, the men who had laughed with him at the widow's folly. He did not tell them what he had seen. He showed them. He led a small procession of them through the deep snow to Alara's cabin. They were skeptical, their faces grim from their own ordeals. They expected to see a trick, or perhaps that the widow had simply been lucky, her cabin sheltered by a unique drift. They knocked on the door, and when Alara opened it, the same quiet miracle that had shattered Silas greeted them. A wave of gentle, even warmth washed over them, a stark contrast to the biting cold they had just left. They stepped inside, one by one, their hats coming off their heads in a slow, unconscious gesture of respect. They saw what Silas had seen: the comfortable child, the clear windows, the absence of a roaring fire. They walked around the room, touching the walls, feeling the air. John Miller, whose daughter was still fighting a fever, put his hand on the brick mass. His expression was one of pure, uncomprehending wonder. "There's no fire," he whispered, as if to himself. "But the whole room, it's warm." They looked at the small, neat pile of wood next to the stove, a pile that should have been consumed in a few hours, but had clearly lasted for days. The evidence was irrefutable. Their laughter echoed in their memories, a sound of profound foolishness. Silas Croft, the respected elder, the master builder, stood before Alara in her small, warm cabin, surrounded by the men who looked to him for guidance. He was not a man given to grand speeches or apologies. His words were as simple and solid as the timbers he worked with. "We were wrong," he said, his voice quiet but clear, carrying to every corner of the room. He looked directly at Alara, his gaze steady. "You were right. I ask you, teach me how to build this." It was not a request, it was a plea. It was the surrender of pride and the embrace of a new truth. The other men murmured their assent, their faces a mixture of shame and hope. In that moment, the social order of the settlement was quietly redrawn. The fragile, foolish widow became their most vital source of wisdom. The underestimated dreamer was now the architect of their future. Alara did not hesitate. She felt no triumph, only a quiet sense of relief. She unrolled her husband's worn journal on the table, the pages filled with his elegant script and precise drawings. The men, who had once scoffed at his books, now crowded around, peering at the diagrams with a desperate intensity. She explained the principles just as she had to Silas, her voice patient and clear. She spoke of the flow of heat, of the importance of the serpentine flue, of the insulating air gap, of the proper mortar. She answered their questions, not as a lecturer, but as a fellow survivor sharing a vital discovery. She gave the knowledge freely, without a hint of reproach for their past mockery. Her only price was that they listen, that they learn, and that they build it right. The spring that followed was unlike any the Blackwood Valley had ever seen. As the great mounds of snow melted and the ground softened, the familiar sounds of construction returned, but the work itself was different. The first task of nearly every family was not to plow their fields or repair their fences, but to build a masonry heater. Under the watchful eye of Silas Croft, who was now Ilara's most diligent student, they trekked to the abandoned brickyard. The place that had been a symbol of failure became the source of their salvation. They laid foundations inside their own cabins. They learned to mix the clay mortar, to sort the bricks, to build the intricate, winding channels. Ilara moved from cabin to cabin, a quiet consultant, checking their work, offering advice, correcting a misplaced brick or an improperly sealed joint. The men who had laughed at her now listened to her every word with rapt attention. They watched her sure, capable hands and saw not a fragile widow, but a master of a craft they were only just beginning to understand. The landscape of the settlement began to change, not on the outside, but on the inside. Cabin by cabin, the cold iron tyrants were augmented by silent, solid hearts of brick, each one a testament to a lesson learned in the crucible of a brutal winter. The story of the widow's folly, which had become the widow's wisdom, did not stay confined to the valley. Travelers passing through that next winter were astonished. They would step out of the biting cold and into a cabin in the Blackwood Valley and find a level of comfort they had never experienced on the frontier. They would ask how it was possible, and they would be shown the simple, ingenious brick heaters. They carried the story with them to other settlements, to towns and outposts across the territory. They brought with them rough sketches, copied from Ilara's designs, and a fervent testimonial. A quiet revolution in building began to spread, a slow, grassroots movement, born not of architects and engineers in a distant city, but of the hard-won experience of a single, observant woman. Ilara never sought credit or praise. She found her reward in the quiet hum of a warm cabin, in the sight of smoke rising from her neighbors' chimneys in the morning and evening, but not in the long, wasteful hours in between. She found it in the face of her son, who would never again have to sleep with his breath pluming in the air. The community's respect was a quiet, constant thing, shown not in grand gestures, but in 1,000 small acts of deference and kindness. They had learned a lesson that winter that went far deeper than the principles of thermal mass. They learned that wisdom is sometimes found in the quietest voices, that the most powerful innovations can come from the most unexpected places, and that the greatest obstacle to survival is not the harshness of the world, but the stubbornness of one's own pride. The cold would come again, as it always did, but the people of the valley were no longer afraid. They had learned to hold the summer, captured in a wall of brick.